it's good to know and understand processes in an analytical way. It's very helpful in running organizations.
I actually, I didn't notice this time. we're just trying to order this more or less exactly the amount we used. I think we can tell them the number tomorrow. No, it's okay. So I'll look for the email. Still time. Yeah, that's why we're chasing people down. Yeah. Yeah, no, I know. Yeah. That's what it is? The longer version is that all?
No, the longer version is that my mother's sister.
Oh, wow.
So it was like crazy times for languages in my family, of which I inherited a very small part focused on fluency and accent. She's dedicated to flagship.
I mean, I just honestly don't know.
She wrote absorbent at amazing and had passion.
And her accents are.
So I, in my mouth when I was in language class, and this is what came out. I mean, I've expanded that vocabulary since then, but the fluency and that I got from her.
My mother spoke a lot of Turkish. Started off already.
No, so my mother started with one and got her.
Wow. See, now I have so much more to talk about.
Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. It's great to have you all here. I think I've met many of you, but I'm still relatively new to the community. My name is Rabbi Julie Roth, and I'm the rabbi here at Shomrei, and we're really happy to be co-sponsoring tonight's conversation with Ner Tamid and B'nai Keshet. And I'm going to start off by inviting Alex Willick, who's here from the New Israel Fund. He's the Associate Director of the New Israel Fund in our region, to give some words of welcome.
Thanks, Rabbi. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm up from Maplewood, but I am the Associate Director of the New Israel Fund for the New York tri-state area. But I have a special love for Jersey, so I'm happy to be up here and representing. First of all, thank you so much to our partnering organization, Shomer Emunah, for hosting, and Rabbi Julie for helping to organize. Thank you so much. Ner Tamid and B'nai Keshet are also co-sponsors, so thank you so much for your participation. The discourse around Israel-Palestine right now, as far as what we're exposed to in the media and especially in social media, and with the loudest, most well-funded, most well-organized organizations, the messaging that those kinds of institutions are promoting is so limited. They are myopic. And how often do you hear a "we stand with Israel" or "free Palestine" with no scaffolding, with no nuance? That is what I perceive to be the primary messaging that we're getting, and I find it to be counterproductive, and it does not get to the root of any problems. So the conversation you're about to hear tonight it transcends that reductive and counterproductive kinds of messaging that we're hearing. Our goal welcome, come on in. Our goal at New Israel Fund, at least, Elaine Cohen, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry.
We're all friends. Our goal at the New Israel Fund, at least here in the United States, is not just to raise money, but also to expose people to the nuanced kinds of conversations and perspectives that are required in order to have any meaningful understanding of what's going on in the region and what could be done to address a fairly intractable solution. Leaders like Rabbi Noa Sattath, whose work we enthusiastically support, are part of a network of heroes of the moment who are doing the especially hard work of pushing back against the forces that for their own political reasons seek to divide us instead of promoting shared society, which is really what is going to be required to get us out of this morass. So I want to bring Rabbi Julie back up to help facilitate that conversation. You'll tell us a little bit more about Rabbi Noah and the work of ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. Thank you so much for schlepping from Israel just for this, to tell us about your work, and thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Alex.
So I just want to start by telling the story of how I first met Noah. I knew Noah when she was working for the Israeli Religious Action Center, which is based in Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And I was volunteering for an activist campaign that was focusing on not creating segregation between men and women on the Haredi bus lines in Israel. And Noah was the person you met with if you were going to volunteer to find out what you had to do. And she basically explained to me how I had to get on the bus at the beginning when nobody was really on the bus and, just sit in the front of the bus. And then when any Haredi men gave me dirty looks like I wasn't supposed to be sitting in the front of the bus, I should just stay there. That was basically the instructions, and it seems so simple, but I was actually very nervous about it. I remember I was like, should I dress like I'm Orthodox? Should I wear my regular clothes? We had all this conversation. And I just remembered feeling so inspired to meet you and to realize that there you were, day in, day out, fighting campaign after campaign, both yourself and with the help of Israeli leaders and American leaders and people who are traveling through. And that was before you arrived at ACRI. And so I'm very eager to hear more about the work you've been doing.
I want to hear about the segregation work. How is it?
How was the experience? Well, so I get on the bus. I'm the only one there, so it's fine. I'm sitting in the front. I didn't give up my seat. That was fine. And then I kept motioning to Haredi women who got on the bus to sit next to me as the bus filled up. The seat is open. And there was this one woman with a baby. And I figured, maybe since she had a baby, she would sit down next to me. So she did, because the bus was full. She was going to have to stand with the baby or sit with me, the only woman sitting in the front of the bus. And then I was how can I engage her in conversation, Because I was dressed modestly, but I'm sure you could tell I certainly didn't look Haredi, And so I decided to say to her, Ize chamuda, what a cutie your baby is. And she immediately started talking to me. It totally worked. And I asked her opinion about, in my broken Hebrew, what did she think about. So I had quite a good experience, actually. Yeah, I don't think I solved the problem of...
Many people were doing this. And I think that the segregation lines in Jerusalem, that you took a bus in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah, it was Jerusalem.
They're no longer segregated. So.
Oh, yay! That applause should really be for Noah. And so I'm very excited to hear about your work with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, which we understand is sort of like the ACLU in Israel. And I just want to say that it's also just personally meaningful to me to have you here in my new congregation. My husband, Rabbi Justice Baird, who works for the Hartman Institute, and I just personally have been longtime supporters of the New Israel Fund to the best that we're able to in terms of our own tzedakah dollars, because we care so much about the state of Israel and we care so much about shared society, and we want to support the efforts of the people doing it on the ground. So let's hear from you. And I want to just start off by asking you, because I imagine, I'm just curious, how many people, by raise of hand, how many people have heard of ACRI before tonight and know what ACRI does? Okay, so that's not bad, but it's not the majority. So can you please tell us a little bit more about what ACRI does in your own words, and just clarify what's the relationship between ACRI and the New Israel Fund?
First of all, thank you. I'm really happy to be here and to reconnect with you and to connect with all of you, and always grateful for the New Israel Fund for their support and their organizing and all the amazing work that they do. Before I tell you a little bit about ACRI, I'd like to steal 2 minutes to tell you about myself, if that's okay.
Please.
Which is also kind of why it's so significant for me to meet with congregations during my travels. And also, maybe it clarifies my connection to NIF, because really NIF has been the force of good in my life for decades. So I was born in Jerusalem to a really, really secular Jewish Israeli family. Our Shabbat tradition was that my father would go to the non-kosher butcher shop and get bacon, and that's what we did on Shabbat morning. And my path to becoming a rabbi really went through social change work. And it began decades ago when I worked for the Jerusalem Open House, which is an NIF grantee, which is the LGBT community center in Jerusalem. And back then, we were the only LGBT organization in town. So I got to work with Palestinian lesbians and ultra-Orthodox gay men in every different sector of Jerusalem that you can imagine, and really learn a lot. And I think that Jerusalem is probably the most religious city in the world that has an LGBT center in it. So that provides many, many interesting opportunities and challenges. And I got to witness how Judaism can be a destructive force, really ruining people's lives, and also, mostly through partnership with American rabbis, I got to see how Judaism can be a force for justice and liberation. And that was really inspiring to me. And when I left there, I joined an organization called MEET, which was founded in MIT in Boston, which is an extracurricular program for outstanding high school students from Israel and the West Bank. And
what's the name again?
MEET. Middle East education through technology. And it was a really interesting program, and I got to learn a lot. And my major challenge there, or my major role in the organization, was looking at the reluctance of the Israeli students to engage with the Palestinian students. So these are 14-year-olds. And it was surprising because MEET, like most encounter programs, is built in favor of the Israelis. The Palestinians have to cross checkpoints in order to get there. And even though we spoke in English, everybody around us spoke in Hebrew, which was very comfortable for the Israelis, very foreign for the Palestinians. And specifically, this was a computer science program. So the Israeli education system is obsessed with preparation for computer science. You do it from first grade. And the Palestinian education system does no preparation for computer science. So the Israeli students had major advantages in the classroom. And still, they were really scared. And the more I looked into it, and I did workshops, and I brought in consultants, it became very apparent to me that the Palestinian students came with a really strong narrative, a really strong sense of self, both religiously and nationally. And the Israeli students, who were all from Jewish secular high schools, who were brilliant, we chose 20 out of 600 candidates, really, really brilliant teens. The only things that they could talk about in terms of their Jewish identity were related to the Holocaust, and they didn't really have a firm grip on that. So questions like, what does it mean to be Jewish? Or why would you want a Jewish state? Or why do you need a Jewish state? All of that was only held within the framework of the Holocaust. And I got to see in that program how people build big walls around themselves when they're not secure in their identity. Because when you don't know who you are, that makes you very vulnerable when you're encountering somebody else. And that has led me to an understanding that has really deepened since that the void in progressive Jewish identity in Israel doesn't only impact important questions like what we do on Shabbat or how we celebrate weddings, but it touches the very core of how we see ourselves and how we see the other and how we think about justice. And that's what led me to rabbinic school, where I went to HUC in Jerusalem, and to many years of working for the Reform movement, trying to build a progressive Jewish identity, for example, connecting with Haredi women, which was a great experience. And 3 years ago, I got to join ACRI, which is the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. ACRI is the oldest and most veteran organization, human rights and civil rights organization in Israel. We celebrated 52 this year. And we are the only organization that advocates across the spectrum of civil and human rights. So we do LGBT rights and women's rights and rights of people with disabilities and prisoners' rights and freedom of expression and freedom of speech and freedom of protest and rights for Arab society in Israel and rights, civil rights and human rights in the West Bank and soon in Gaza. So we have a very, very broad mandate and very broad scope. And we are responsible for many of the achievements of human rights that you know in Israel. And we are the flagship grantee of the NIF, so we have a very, very close partnership spanning 40-something years with NIF. And we are very, very aligned in our goals and our thinking.
So I don't know if I would know offhand some of those human rights achievements that you referred to that ACRI really was behind. Can you give us one or two examples?
Sure. So I think ACRI has two major roles, or maybe three major roles. One is we do the classic human rights work that my colleagues in the ACLU, the CCLA in Canada, all of the big civil liberties organizations do. Freedom of protest, freedom of expression, prisoners' rights. And in those areas, ACRI has been the forefront in securing those rights that have been threatened in different times, providing minimal living space for prisoners, ensuring the right to protest, preventing closure of media channels. We've done that many, many times. But the second role that we have that I really love is what I call the midwife role, which is we kind of give birth to new ideas and new concepts of human rights, which are mostly then taken by other organizations. So in the 80s, we were the first organization advocating for human and civil rights for people with disabilities. And we kind of gave birth to many different organizations that are leading that area today. And we got the first legislation on accessibility. Later in the 90s, we did a lot of gay and lesbian cases, same-sex marriages, same-sex couples, all of that. Same-sex adoption was all secured by precedents that we set, non-discrimination in the workplace. All of that was done by ACRI. And also in the late 90s, we started doing a lot of, and now there are multiple LGBT organizations in Israel doing the gay and lesbian legislation, and we are only holding on to the trans issues. And I'm very sure that in 5 years there would be maturity in the trans organizations to lead these issues forward, and will always be there, but those organizations will take that on. It's the same thing with rights of asylum seekers and labor immigrants. We started those issues. Now there are multiple organizations that deal with the individual cases, and we do the constitutional cases around those issues. So it's very, very hard to choose like 2 examples, but I think my favorites would be guaranteeing that the equality in land purchase between Arab and Jewish Israeli citizens, when in the past there was an ability of people to deny Arabs the ability to purchase land and homes, and ACRI reversed that, and maybe the closure of the Cholot detention center, which was a special prison for asylum seekers that was built where people were held in very bad conditions and without the proper trials for many, many years, and we got that detention center closed.
Wow, kol kavod. It's very powerful. I don't think I realized how broad the sweep of civil rights focal points there are within ACRI. I'm curious now to focus on this moment. We're now already many months into this current war, and so how has the situation in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, or in Israel proper, so to speak, how has that impacted your work, especially on Palestinian civil rights or human rights?
So just going back to October 6th, we were facing a very difficult situation with an anti-democratic revolution that the government was attempting to mobilize. And we had an extremely challenging year trying to fend off that attack. And we were in a very challenging place in terms of human rights. And then, of course, the war started and every single area got much, much worse. And we were trying to handle that in the same time as we, as all Israelis, were grieving and anxious. And I think that one of the differences between the situation here and the situation in Israel is the very kind of natural ability to hold both. During the beginning of the war, we had dealt with, and we're still dealing with, but much less, the issue of blockades around villages in the West Bank. And our chief lawyer that does human rights work in the West Bank, her sister-in-law was kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival. And she was advocating for her sister-in-law and at the same time as doing the work. And I was interviewing for an American media outlet about these blockades, and I tried to explain, and it was like hundreds of blockades.
Can you explain the blockades to us a little bit more?
So it's a village, a Palestinian village, that would be surrounded by military, so people wouldn't be able to get in and out for work, for study, even for, in some cases, for hospitals. So that's a huge infringement of on human rights, and we were one by one trying to remove these blockades. We've been successful in most of them. But there are some areas where the blockades are still persistent. So I was interviewing on that, but there are many very complex questions. And at a certain point, I told the reporter, listen, I think that it's best if you speak to the lawyer. I'll text you her number, and she can give you all the information. She is the expert. And then I finished the conversation, and I remember that the lawyer was meeting with the Romanian Prime Minister advocating for her sister-in-law that day. So I texted him the number, and I said, she's very busy today meeting with the Romanian Prime Minister because her sister-in-law is kidnapped, and text her and she'll get back to you as soon as she can. And then he immediately called me back and said, her sister-in-law is kidnapped and she's working on human rights for Palestinians? And the answer is yes. I mean, we hold both very firmly. We hold the grieving and the pain and the fear and the anxiety, and we hold the commitment to human rights at the same time. And it's a big, just that is a big load to carry.
So how do you do that? I mean, on the one hand, you're sort of like, we're Israeli, so we just hold both, you know, and on some level, like when you grow up in Israel, you do have to deal with terrorism and go on with life. But it's sort of unimaginable what you're describing, and so why do you think it is that you or she or others who do the work with ACRI are able to hold both of those things? Or how do they? What's the coping strategy for that?
I think that the ability to distinguish between Hamas and the rest of Palestinian society and Israelis and the Israeli government is much easier in Israel than it is here. So you get more nuance, and that makes it much, much easier. But in response to what happened, and so at the beginning of the war, there was just a feeling of everything collapsing. Prisoners' rights, the government immediately passed emergency regulations, which is like fast-track legislation that happens during wartime, taking away prisoners' rights. There were bans on demonstrations. There were massive arrests of people from Palestinian society for all sorts of benign posts on social media. So those were the immediate, and there were these blockades in the West Bank. So we immediately had to react on all those fronts. We've been to the Supreme Court over 40 times since the beginning of the war. And at the beginning of the war, it was very, very difficult, and now it's becoming we are regaining the attention of the court. I'll tell you that yesterday we were in a constitutional appeal against the law closing the Al Jazeera station in Israel, because we're very worried about closing media channels. That's a very anti-democratic move. And tomorrow we will be in the Supreme Court arguing for the closure of this Detaiman detention center, which is a new detention center enacted by a different law than the prison service law for prisoners from Gaza. It's kind of like what we're thinking of as the Israeli Guantanamo, and we're pushing very, very early for it to be closed before it becomes the problem that we know Guantanamo still is today. So it's a very vast array of issues that we have to react to all the time, and it's very hard.
So I have two different questions. They're totally different, but I'm going to ask them together. One is, just in your own heart or your own analysis, to what degree do you think that these suppressions that happened after the war were security motivated, and in what ways do you think that they were like it was more opportunistic? Like we have a war situation, we have the opportunity to do things we might have wanted to do otherwise. Maybe I'll ask you one question at a time. That's my first question.
That's hard to tell. I mean, for instance, the closure of the Al Jazeera station, that was a goal for the government before the war began. And even now, they're not really supplying security arguments against it. They're saying that it provides inaccurate information, which may be true, but not uniquely Al Jazeera. And they're saying that it's hurting morale, but it's not really a firm security argument. I'm trying. I think that a lot of it was opportunistic. Certainly, some of the things that we're seeing in the police were plans that the Minister of Interior Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, had ahead of time, and he is now grabbing the opportunity to make them happen. We're seeing a lot of land grabs in the West Bank that are just the minister is using, Minister Smotrich is using the opportunity to do it. One of the things that we were able to reverse pretty early on in the war is the bans on anti-war demonstrations, which I think the police were just saying, listen, we got enough on our plates, let's avoid this, and we had to kind of remind the court that their job is to secure demonstrations, even in times of war.
So what you describe is a barrage of issues.
I love that. I did not know that word, but I will use it all the time now.
40 cases before the Supreme Court, reacting to this, reacting to that, reacting to this. At this moment, does it feel like the strategy in connection to the war is still primarily reactive, or is it possible to breathe enough to, take in a sense like a proactive approach?
I think that we are. I think that we're, as a metaphor, we're in the midst of an earthquake, and the ground hasn't stopped moving yet. So I can't really say what buildings will remain standing and what buildings will collapse. But I can already see some buildings have collapsed. So we can begin to address that, and we're trying. And in many cases, just the feeling is that the discourse on human rights has been so eroded that we are going back to basics of explaining why human rights are important, why you can't torture people. I mean, these are not things that I had to explain 9 months ago. And so we, you have to, like all of us in this war region, will have to, please God soon, we'll have to say, okay, we have to rebuild. We have to find the powers within ourselves to rebuild. So we're doing some of that. Also, in 2006, ACRI really closed our Gaza unit, which we are reopening now, and understanding that we will have to do a lot of work in Gaza in the coming years at least.
Has that work begun, or is it more in preparation?
So we're partners in an appeal for humanitarian aid, which is still ongoing. We have been successful in that appeal in driving a lot more aid in through more of the checkpoints. We've been able to reconnect the water network, which is huge in the summer. But the main point of the appeal is that since Israel is now the occupying force in Gaza, then Israel has responsibility for every Gazan civilian, like an occupying force in any other country. So it's not that Israel can allow or disallow aid in. Israel is responsible for the delivery of the aid, even if it's not donated by Qatar. That point is still ongoing with the court, and I think it will take a while. And the next stages that we're planning for is that when the war ends, hopefully soon, we believe that that Israel will want to redraw the border to basically maybe create another wall or create a security zone within Gaza. And we have had a lot of experience with the building of the separation wall in the West Bank in litigation around the place of the wall versus human rights. And so I think that we will have to re-argue that in many cases in Gaza in the years to come.
Noah, I feel almost a little embarrassed by my last question, in the sense that when you said we're still in the middle of an earthquake, it just made me realize that it's easy as an American Jew to feel like the earthquake is over. I think more than as it compared to being in Israel. I think that's actually one of the fundamental differences right now between American Jews and Israeli Jews, even ones who are very connected. It feels it feels different to us now than it did some number of months ago, in a way that I think is different for Americans than Israelis, perhaps. But I don't know. Your answer, we're in the middle of an earthquake, kind of highlighted for me like what I think might be some of the differences right now between the American Jewish community, which is obviously a very diverse community, right? Very, very diverse. And the Israeli community, also very, very diverse. But just as someone who's been to the United States many times, and as you were here, I think, last week also, right? And then you went back, and then you came back, so, which you're not going to do again, you said, is too much, but we're glad you're here. My question is, like, what do you think, how would you characterize right now the relationship between American Jews and Israeli Jews?
Well, I think it's complicated. I think on the one hand, there's a sense of closeness, right, and solidarity more than maybe before, and concern. I feel a lot of concern from American Jews towards Israel right now. But yeah, the experience in Israel is all immersive. Both in the sense of it's the best part of Israeli society. It's why I live there, is the solidarity. But that makes the issue of the hostages always very, very, very prominent. Like in everyday Israel, you can't exist without feeling the burden of the sadness and the anxiety and the despair of the hostage situation everywhere you go. Even if you don't know any of the hostages, and many, many of us, including me, do, it's just everywhere. And that is, I think, very disconnected from and that's part of the Israeli ethos, that we worry about each other, and we are one community, and we are. So I think that is one thing. And I also think that one of the things that is different in the experience of the communities, or maybe it's the same thing but it's experienced very differently, is the absolute failure of government. Absolute in every way. So not just, people were in their homes being attacked and kidnapped, and there was no army to get them, even though the army was supposed to be there within 10 minutes. But it's ongoing. The government is still not functioning. The ministers are still not coming to funerals. And civil society is really responding to that. But just like after the war, after the beginning of the war, there were weeks of multiple funerals. And it is a tradition in Israel that there is a government representative in every funeral, and they wouldn't come. So there was a group of people who were like Israel Prize winners and ambassadors and Olympic medal winners who would come to these funerals. So they would go to 4 or 5 funerals a day to represent Israel. And the ministers were not there, and they're still not there. We just had 4 hostages that were declared dead yesterday. They didn't get a call from the government. It's just like, and it's very stark in comparison with the American government for the American hostages, and how much the American administration is in touch with the families, and Biden has spoken to all of the families, but Netanyahu hasn't. And even without, not considering the war, right? Just in terms of welfare and education, and it's all in such shambles with 100,000 people, which, if you did it in American numbers, that would be almost 4 million people displaced. And today, Minister Regev said, who is our transportation minister, she said, the government's been doing such amazing work. So many people are in hotels on the expense of the government. These are people who are living in hotels for 8 months now and have no prospect of going back home because of the failure of the government. And it's just everywhere. So there's a feeling of abandonment that I think American Jews are very angry at the government. Right, hold on to that anger. There's many reasons to be angry, right? Israelis are in many ways very angry, but just, it's a different feeling of just having, it's not the politics that have failed, they have failed, but it's the civil structure that has failed so consistently and across the board. Last week we filed an appeal for the students in Kiryat Shmona, which is a Likud city. They never need our help. They have access to the government. They never need our help. But their students are not getting the exemptions in their SATs that the students in the South are getting. And these are students who have been evacuated from their homes on October 7th and then told that they'd be back home by December. So they moved one place, and then they told they'd be back home by April. And so sometimes they moved several schools, and then now are being told that they'd come home maybe September 1st, maybe no. So the uncertainty that these students have had to live with is even graver than those in the South. But there's just nobody to talk to in government. And that's, I think that's just, I mean, these are two shades, and I mean, what most American Jews are feeling is the frustration with the war and the way it's managed and the disrespect to Biden, and Israelis are seeing all of that. But on the very day-to-day level, there's just failure after failure, and people are very, it's a different feeling. But I think that, I hope that for many of us, October 7th is the defining worst event of our lifetime, hopefully, if things don't get worse. And that's a common theme, right? The fear and the sadness and the grief. And also, for Palestinians, the war is the defining moment of their national history. And the question is how we grow from here, how we learn from this, how we evolve.
You know what I found powerful and different about the American-Israeli relationship is that Israelis are asking Americans if they're okay with the anti-Semitism. And I've probably never in my life had Israelis ask me if I was okay as an American. And from the American eyes, the mobilization of civil society in Israel it's unbelievable. Like, it's something that I don't think we could ever imagine seeing in our own country. So I want to open it up for some Q&A. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone around.
We're going to keep the questions short and as questions.
Thank you for being here and for your work. I'll be short, but I have two questions, one post-October 7th, one mainly before. I've read multiple reports that the treatment of a certain cadre of Palestinian prisoners of war has been so grievous as to have resulted in the loss of limbs. And so my question there is, do you know that to be true, and if so, how widespread? And then the mainly pre-October 7th question is, where stands the so-called judicial reform? I state what I think I know, so you can correct me, that by one vote in the Supreme Court, the court's ability to declare invalid acts of Knesset, the only check or balance in your system, survives. And I think Netanyahu's too weak to try again on that, but I think on other fronts, like the appointment of judges, the efforts to weaken the judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court, continue. So where does that all stand, please?
I think she wants to take even more questions and then she will further.
I don't know if this is an area that ACRI is directly working on, but please comment on the many pitch situations where West Bank settler groups, right-wing groups, have been blocking the aid trucks coming through the West Bank and in other areas, and where that stands now.
I think I can do one more.
Okay.
You're the next round. Okay, you'll be first.
How serious a problem is it with the increased arming of settlers on the West Bank? Have we reached a point where even if the government wanted to constrain their activity, it may not even have the means of doing so because it would involve intense violence with the settlers?
Okay, thank you for those questions. So in terms of your question about prisoners' rights, we've seen the prisoners' rights were the first thing damaged by this war. And we've seen it on multiple fronts. ACRI, for many years of litigation, got minimal standards for prisoners, all prisoners. And those were nullified in the beginning of the war, and we've not been able to bring them back. But specifically, Israel has two categories of prisoners. One is criminal prisoners, which means people who are charged with drug issues, transportation issues, violence. Those could be Jewish or Arab, all citizens of Israel. And then there's a separate category called security prisoners. And these are people who are charged with or convicted for offenses connected to terrorism. And that could be anywhere from rock throwing and posting on social media to mass murders. All of them are in one category. And the conditions of those prisoners have been even worsened. And mostly what we're concerned about is the lack of transparency. So in the past, of course, all prisoners were allowed lawyer visits. Those have been canceled for now 8 months. And the Red Cross is not allowed to enter to visit the Palestinian prisoners, both the Palestinian prisoners who have been in Israel on October 7th in prison, and those taken during the October 7th attack and afterwards in Gaza. And that leads to a grave lack of transparency. We have appealed to the Supreme Court twice on these issues, one on the issue of starvation, just the limitation of food in a way that is very, very concerning. That's for all of the security prisoners as we understand it. And two, for the specific detention center, which is called Sde Teiman, which is specific for Gazan prisoners. Now we are getting reports, because we can't visit and no lawyers can visit and the Red Cross can't visit. What we're basing our appeals on are reports. So the reports that we're getting about Sde Teiman is from people who were taken in Gaza. So thousands of people were taken in Gaza and then interrogated, and many of them were found not relevant and returned to Gaza. But what they have told us is that prisoners have no access to toilets, they are in diapers, that they're held constrained in their cells, and they spoke about violence. And in our appeal, we're also quoting testaments of doctors who were reporting the removal of limbs because people were tied for so long in such conditions. On the optimistic side, I've been working with the courts for 20 years. We have never had such a quick response from the court to an appeal, which I'm hoping means that the court sees the seriousness of this situation in the same way that we do. And I invite you to watch our reports tomorrow to see how the first hearing goes. I'm sure we're not going to get to close the center at the first trial, but maybe we'll get to better conditions and we will continue to fight until we can close it. In terms of the judicial overhaul, So ACRI, during the first year of the government, before October 7th, we spoke about 3 different revolutions that were happening at the same time. One is the attempted judicial overhaul, which were the 6 laws that Minister Yariv Levin proposed in order to change the structure of the system and remove the checks and balances. Second was the settlement revolution leading to annexation. And third was a slew of other anti-democratic legislation, 220 different bills that were trying to undermine the democratic principles. Yeah, examples, an ability to close media channels, death penalty, different issues that were brought up in order to weaken the democratic structure. I think it's interesting that to see that the government, even though it had a firm majority, was not able to move almost any pieces of legislation. So that kind of speaks to the strength of the protest movement. And before October 7th, Israel, in a per capita way, had the largest protest movement in human history. Right? We had 2 to 8% of the population. In American numbers, that would be about 4 million to 16 million people on the streets every single week for 40 weeks. And that was really, it shows the power of protest. So that was mostly limited. The legislation was very, very minimal. And the one law that did pass was then overturned by the Supreme Court. The settlement revolution, however, is very advanced, which would also lead me to the next question soon. And the other legislation did not pass, but I think that our gravest concern is the issue of the nominations in the police, where Minister Ben-Gvir was able to nominate so many people in the police that the very problematic nature of our relationship with the police before October 7th has really transformed to a very different and very bad reality. And the rebuilding of the police is one of the things that we will have to think about in the next government. In relation to what is going on in the West Bank in terms of the destruction of food, our colleagues in Umdim B'Yachad created these humanitarian protection of the envoys, and we have threatened the police with a Supreme Court appeal against this. And so far, we're seeing that the destruction of the food is limited. So, you know, never say that you've won, but it seems that for now, it is happening less. So that is good news. In terms of the armament, that's, for me, that's one of the rocks that I'm seeing thrown into the well, and I'm asking myself, how are we ever going to get that out? But Israel had a much less severe gun problem than the US before October 7th. And that's because we had very clear method of screening and testing before, and training before guns could be purchased. Since the beginning of the war, Minister Ben-Gvir, when people were so insecure and so distrustful of the police and the ability to get protection from the police and the military, rather than saying, we're the government, we've failed on October 7th, but we will protect you going forward, he said, well, I'm sorry, the police can't protect you. Here, have a gun. And if on October 7th there were 130,000 guns with licenses in Israel, now there are 240,000, and we anticipate that by the end of 2024 there will be 300,000. So we are working very hard now to track the weapons so that we can try and do something in the next government. Guns are very popular now in Israel. People want guns because they feel so insecure. And we know that, rationally, that when the people have guns in the houses, they are much, much more likely to kill one of the members of the house than they are to kill a perpetrator. But people feel very, very insecure right now. And I just want to say that not all of those guns went to settlers. Many of them went to people in different cities inside Israel. But the lawlessness in the settlements and the impunity is something that dealing with will require very strict enforcement going forward. Right now, settlers can be violent with impunity and nobody is stopping them, nobody's even trying. And they're not expecting anybody to try. Hello.
Was everyone's questions answered? Yeah, okay. Are there any others?
There was one here.
Carol, and I know there was one over.
You're doing so many things. I want to really thank you. It feels like a whack-a-mole, you know, like you take care of this one and that one pops up. And I want to invite you to take a bit of a longer view, the so-called day after, as Standing Together says. And what do you imagine that when this war has to end at some point, Netanyahu has to be out of power at some point, you know, what do you want it to look like? What do people who are fighting for equality and civil rights and even, you know, potentially rights for Palestinian citizens in Israel and some kind of real solution in the West Bank and Gaza, what do you see? I mean, what do you imagine? What are you fighting for?
Like everyone else in the room, thank you so much for all the work that you and your colleagues do. It's really heartwarming to be reminded that you're there doing it. But my question ties into that. So the limited Israeli circle who I communicate with don't sound anything like you. And so my question is, when you say that Israeli society wants X or wants Y, are the people who I'm talking to not hearing about these things or doubling down because of the fear and insecurity into choosing not to hear these things? And how do you bring a majority forward to bring back the Israel that you dream of?
Is it? Yes. I'm just wondering if you can also address what's happened in terms of the status of Arab Israelis. Has there been issues with? I think that the answer is yes. But can you talk about what's happened with the rights and the discrimination and treatment of Arab Israelis?
Let's start with those. So obviously, I spend a lot of time thinking about your question. And mostly about how we get there, right? And it's very hard when we don't know what when the next phase will come to understand how it will look. I'll give a few pointers. I don't know if they're enough. But I think that for us at ACRI, unlike Standing Together, we haven't in the past, and we're not now offering a two-state solution or a one-state solution. Our mandate is human rights, and we are kind of, as an organization, indifferent. Anything that protects human rights, we're game. I think that protecting the basic notion that of human rights is very difficult right now. And maybe that also corresponds to your question about how average Israelis feel. So I don't know, who you're communicating with, but a recent survey found that only 4% of Israeli Jewish, a recent poll found that only 4% of Israeli Jewish citizens think that the war in Gaza has been excessive. That's very low, right? And
That's interesting. Wow.
yes, So a lot of people want the war to end because it's not reaching its goals or they want the hostages back. But very few people are concerned about Gazans. And first of all, it's a mirror image of polls in Palestinian society that show a majority of support for October 7th. And that's because in Palestinian society, the major news outlets have not shown October 7th in the same way. And in Israeli news outlets, there is absolutely no way to follow the situation in Gaza. If you open the TV on one of the 4 channels in Hebrew, zero coverage of what's going on in Gaza. There's nonstop news, nothing about civilians in Gaza. There's a lot of coverage from the soldiers' point of view of what's going on in Gaza, but most soldiers don't interact with civilians, so they're looking at debris or tanks, but not civilians. But I also want to recognize that Israelis are not post-traumatic, they're just traumatic right now. What Israelis are feeling is trauma and grief. And as a rabbi, I know that empathy is one of the things that is really eroded by grief. When you're in the height of grief, it's very hard to feel empathy. But that usually passes within a few weeks. And a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with this organizational psychologist who spoke to me about something called obscure grief, which is kind of the continuation of am I in grief or am I not in grief situation, which is what the hostage situation is causing. So Israelis are not, they're not in Shiva, they're in the before stage, which is why the empathy is so eroded. And, it's very anecdotal, but many of my peers and friends tell me, I know that I should be feeling empathy, and I'm not. I know that these images should concern me, but I can't feel it. And that is a very prevalent feeling right now. So I think we need to restore that. Going back to that is the basic thing that we need to restore. I also am thinking about how so many things collapsed for Israelis since October 7th. The faith in the government, the faith in the military. About a few years ago, I went with a friend of mine to her son's military graduation. So Israelis don't do a lot with graduating from college, but graduating from military course is a big thing. So I went with her to her son's graduation, and we came to an army base in the south, and there were like hundreds of parents there. And there was this big commander sitting on a stage by a table, and screen behind him. And in the beginning of the ceremony, the commander takes a can of canned corn and opens it. And on the screen, you can see the corn, each kernel of corn. You can see it so clearly. And then he asks, where's the camera? And you look up into the sky, and it's a dot that gets you this clear picture of every kernel of corn. And then he says, this is how we know everything that goes on in Gaza. And I don't believe anything that the military says, but I saw the corn. It was so convincing. No. The military technology completely failed the Israelis. Constantly failed the Israelis. And I think that the reckoning of that is coming. I mean, it's Israel, because the war is still ongoing, there's not the reckoning that comes after a war. And I also think that the one thing that has really been resilient during this time are the peace agreements, right? Who would have believed that the peace agreements would survive this? I watched the hostage releases with, I have a very sweet 90-year-old friend. So we watched one of the hostage releases when the exchange points became known in Gaza. And it was very, Red Cross trucks were attacked. And then Egyptian soldiers, because the Red Cross doesn't carry weapons, Egyptian army convoys came to accompany the Red Cross trucks. And he said, who would have believed 50 years ago that the Egyptians would be the ones caring for our hostages? And you saw Jordan during the Iranian attack. So I think that in time, these are the things that we need to emphasize and talk about. But the road for that is long. Definitely, the road for that is long. And I think we need to recognize that. Like, at least for me, I feel like we are navigating in the dark, and there's no pointers. And the only thing that we can hold on to is our values and our work, and try again and again and again until the path emerges. I mean, there's no, I'm sorry, maybe Omdim B'Yachad can do it, but I can't draw a map for you from here to where it gets better. I know that we're committed to really focusing on everything that we can do to promote a vision of equality and peace and human rights. And that's what we can do right now in this very, very, very trying time. In terms of where Israelis are, I think that Israelis are with profound dissatisfaction with the government, profound, and anger and frustration and fear, and they are working on that. And they're not asking themselves the questions that maybe you're asking yourselves about the way the war is conducted and the way, they're not so much there. But the time for that will come. I mean, this event will be analyzed for years to come, and Israelis will have to reckon with everything that Israel is doing right now. In terms of your question about Arab society within Israel, I think that one of the major differences between, we were speaking about the differences between Israelis and Americans, that in many senses in Israel, this is perceived as an attack against Israel, not as an attack against Jews, because of course there were Bedouin victims and Muslim victims and Thai victims and Nepalese victims, and it was just everybody who was there. And so in many senses, the grief and the anxiety is shared. And many, if the vast majority of Palestinian citizens of Israel are not supportive of Hamas and fearful of Hamas. But on the other hand, in the beginning of the war, the police started massive arrests of Palestinian citizens for benign expressions mostly benign expressions on Facebook. I have a colleague of mine who is head of a Palestinian women's rights organization. She was arrested for posting the occupation is the root of all terrorism. That's what she wrote on Facebook, and 45 minutes later, the police knocks on the door. And the chilling effect of that, she was released the next day. She spent the night in prison. The judge said to the police, "What are you talking about?" and released her. Like many, many other Palestinian citizens were arrested and then released. But the chilling effect that that has is immense, and working to restore people's faith in the system that allows them to express their opinions is going to take time. I think we're seeing the beginning of that, and for example, in Palestinian participation in protests is increasing, but there's a way to go, definitely a way to go there.
Noah, I think if in the beginning, when you were introduced, Alex said you were one of the heroes fighting for human rights. If we heard those words, but we, thought maybe it was just a saying, after listening to you speak for this last hour, I think we can all see even just, we could sit here for hours more, but just in the hour you've shared, how remarkable the work that you are doing to fight for human rights in Israel truly is. I want to say to everyone here, if you want to make her job a little bit easier, one thing you can definitely do is donate money. You can donate to the New Israel Fund. You can donate to ACRI directly, so she doesn't have to chase money as much and can just chase human rights. I just want to ask you one last question as we close up, because honestly, I don't know how you get up in the morning every day and you do this work. I was supposed to ask you, like, what gives you hope? You can answer that if you want, but what gives you koach? What gives you the strength to get up day after day and to face these challenges and to, keep fighting? Fighting when you win, fighting when the target moves. What gives you koach? What gives you hope?
I was thinking about it as we near the end of Sfirat HaOmer, that kind of our tradition teaches us to count every day and feel the weight of every day for 49 days, right? And that's like, traditionally, that's a very long mourning period. And those numbers that we're looking at now, like 242 days of war and 124 hostages and 1,500 dead in Israel and 35,000 dead in Gaza. I mean, these numbers are so unbearable. Every one of them is unbearable. And sometimes I feel like when I'm at work, I'm very busy, but when I'm going to work and from work, I sometimes feel like I'm carrying this invisible backpack of sadness full of rocks that are just unbearable. So I think that I'm drawing from my experience in the rabbinate of seeing people in grief and knowing that grief in the beginning is overwhelming and that it doesn't subside, but you develop the muscles to feel other things in parallel to the grief and do your work and survive and thrive. And I am banking on strengthening my muscles so that we can carry this. I think that that's the only way. This is the weight of our lifetime that will not go away. We will need to learn to carry it with us towards any future that we will build. And so I draw a lot on faith. I say, if this is the trial, then we will have to be successful in this trial. And I'm very inspired by my staff that are just, every human rights violation, every person that we can help, they're so passionate about it. They are chasing it. They're working at 2 a.m. They're facing violence from, people in the streets or people in the courts, and they're still saying, we will not leave any stone unturned. We will do whatever we can in this trying time so that we can, and that's something that we're going back to. We're saying, in 5 years, in 10 years, we're going to look back and be proud of what we did. And that's what motivates us. And also I want to say, it's a hard time if people are feeling that it's hard to get out of bed. It's hard to get out of bed. It's okay. It's okay to feel that as well. It's really a historic time of test, and sometimes it's hard to get out of bed. But also, listen, I think that a lot of people have been feeling since October 7th that are very isolated. And I get to talk to a lot of people who are feeling the same thing and feeling very alone. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to build this community of people who care deeply about Israel and care deeply about human rights and equality and peace and want to have a nuanced conversation. And NIF is doing that, and our synagogues are doing that, and a lot of organizations in Israel are doing that. And we will rebuild this community and learn from what has happened and move forward. So I have a lot of faith in that. And I invite you to join the ACRI newsletter, where we tell you about our work every couple weeks. So we try to bring you into the conversation. You can scan a barcode in the beginning, in the entrance.
Well, we're so grateful that you got out of bed and got on the airplane and came to visit us. Chazak, chazak, v'nid chazek.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Noah. I want to thank you all again for availing yourself of this opportunity to take this complicated and difficult story and use it to, I will use it to shield myself from the very, the barrage of kind of news media of trying to feed me very simplistic narratives on what's going on. Because this is the real, the difficult, the nuanced perspective that is impossible to tweet. You have to engage in conversation, and you have to hear these narratives and grapple with them. So thank you for availing yourself of this opportunity. Ask yourself if checking the New York Times 3 times a day is serving you and your mental health. Doesn't help me. But I feel similarly, I can get out of bed every morning and have a role to play by my work at NIF and for raising money for organizations like ACRI. Thank you, Rabbi Julie, for offering your space. Noah and I will both be here on the way out. We each have material for you if you want to talk. I'm here in New Jersey. I'd love to meet you. Come say hi. But thank you so much for coming out and making this all possible for us.
I just also want to thank Ner Tamid and B'nai Keshet again for co-sponsoring. I think that's a very special part of our community. Cantor Greenberg, thanks for being here. Rabbi Marquez was here earlier. Thank you, everyone.
to my car. So it's like, it's a liquid shock or whatever, just like, all over, and then we have the, right, so, and then all the kids came, so it
Well, no, but yes, I mean, we need like for hours. Engaged to some
What they need is a rabbi. Yeah. They have many lawyers, but they need a rabbi.